They laughed at him for fishing in a desert pond, but he caught the biggest fish in the region. Michael felt sweat trickling down his forehead as he walked with his fishing rod toward the small pond everyone called Fool's Pond. It was the 5th time that week he'd made the same 2-hour trek on foot through the arid terrain of Ridge Creek, a tiny town lost in the heart of Arizona. Behind him, the laughter of his 2 best friends echoed through the dry morning air. "Michael, you're wasting your time, man," shouted Jason, the youngest of the group at 26, clutching his stomach from laughing so hard. "That pond's as dry as the rest of this place." "Leave him be, Jason," said Brian, adjusting his sweat-soaked black t-shirt. "If my brother wants to waste his time fishing in a puddle, that's his problem. But don't come complaining when you get home empty-handed again." Michael stopped and turned to face them, his brown eyes gleaming with a determination his friends still didn't understand. At 28, he carried the weight of supporting his sick mother and proving to the whole town that he wasn't just another dreamer lost in the desert heat. "You'll see," he murmured to himself, ignoring their taunts. "You'll see." The walk to the pond always brought him painful memories. 3 months ago, when his father had left to work on a farm in Chicago and never returned, Michael had to take on the responsibilities of the household. Mrs. Helen, his mother, battled an illness the local doctors couldn't properly diagnose, and expensive medications ate up whatever money he managed to scrape together from odd jobs in town. Fishing had always been his passion, something he learned from his maternal grandfather as a child. But in recent months, it had become his only hope for extra income. The problem was, all the good fishing spots in the area were controlled by the local fishermen's group, led by Frank Thompson, a 50-year-old man who monopolized the best waters and didn't allow amateurs like Michael to fish in his territory. "Kid, you're wasting your time," Frank had told him the week before when Michael tried fishing at the town's main reservoir. "Fishing is serious business, not some game for a boy who doesn't even know how to hold a rod right." That's when Michael remembered the old pond, isolated in the driest part of the region. His grandfather used to tell stories about giant fish living in those waters, but everyone thought they were just old fishermen's tales. The pond had been forgotten for decades, considered too barren to be worth the hike. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, take a moment to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It helps us newcomers a lot. Now back to the story. When they finally reached the edge of the pond, the sight before them seemed to confirm all the negative remarks Michael had heard. The water was murky, and the level had visibly dropped after months of drought. Withered plants dotted the banks, and the silence was broken only by the distant sound of wind whistling through the rocks. "Man, look at this place," Brian said, shaking his head in disappointment. "There's probably not even a turtle in here." Jason stepped closer to the bank and eyed the water skeptically. "Michael, are you sure it's worth wasting hooks and line here? You can see the bottom in some spots." But Michael refused to be discouraged. Something inside him insisted that this pond held secrets no one else had discovered. He set up his simple gear, a bamboo rod he'd made himself and a few hooks he'd bartered for in town. His bait was just worms he had dug up in the backyard before leaving. "I'll try near those rocks," he said, pointing to an area where some stones formed a sort of natural shelter. The first attempt was a complete failure. After 2 hours of waiting, Michael didn't even get a single bite. Jason and Brian had grown tired of waiting and decided to head back to town, leaving him alone with his increasingly shaken determination. "I'll come back tomorrow," he murmured to himself, carefully packing up his gear. The way back took even longer than the trip there. The midday sun beat down mercilessly, and Michael had to stop several times to rest in the scarce shade of a few plants. When he finally got home, he found his mother sitting on the porch, her face wearing the worried expression that had become constant over the last few months. "So, son, catch anything?" asked Mrs. Helen, trying to hide the anxiety in her voice. "Not yet, Mom, but I'll try again tomorrow," Michael replied, sitting beside her. "Michael, maybe it's time you accept the job Mr. Joe offered at the grocery store. It's not much, but it's steady money every month." His mother's suggestion echoed in Michael's mind all night. Working at the grocery store would mean financial security, but it would also mean giving up on his dream and admitting that Frank was right, that he was just an amateur. More than that, It would mean he'd never get the chance to prove he was capable of something greater. The next morning, against all advice and taunts, Michael made the trip back to the pond. This time, though, he decided to explore a different area. He walked around the pond until he found a small channel that seemed to lead to a deeper spot, hidden behind a rocky formation. There, the water was darker and felt cooler to the touch. Michael sensed something different about this place, as if something important was waiting for him. He prepared his gear even more carefully, selecting the best worms and adjusting the line's depth based on what he could observe. 3 hours of patient waiting passed. The sun was already high when Michael felt the first real bite in days. His heart raced, but he forced himself to stay calm, just as his grandfather had taught him. He couldn't lose this chance out of excitement. The hook set was firm and precise. Immediately, Michael knew there was something different about what was on the other end of the line. The weight was greater than any fish he'd ever caught, and the fight was impressive. For several minutes, he waged a silent battle with the unseen creature, using all his experience to keep the makeshift line from snapping. When he finally brought the fish to the surface, Michael could hardly believe his eyes. It was a bass of a size he never thought possible in that area, at least 7.5 pounds. Its scales shimmered in the sun like silver coins, and the fish still fought fiercely even out of the water. "I can't believe it," he whispered to himself, carefully holding his catch. But his joy was short-lived. When he got back to town with the fish, the reaction wasn't what he'd expected. Instead of admiration, he faced skepticism. Frank was the first to question his achievement. "That fish didn't come from that dried-up pond," the older fisherman said, examining the base with an expert eye. "This here's a river fish. Who you trying to fool, kid?" "I did catch it, Mr. Frank. In the pond on the dry land," Michael insisted, but he could tell his words weren't convincing anyone. "Michael, cut the nonsense," Brian chimed in, drawn by the small crowd that had gathered. "You bought that fish somewhere, and now you're trying to pass yourself off as a fisherman." The accusation from his own friend stung more than Michael had expected. He tried to explain how he'd found the hidden channel and how he'd felt that place was special, but the more he spoke, the more ridiculous it sounded to the others. "Look, Michael," said Jason, trying to be kind, "we saw you yesterday trying to fish in that spot. There's no way a fish that size could be there." "Did you see anything yesterday?" Michael asked, frustrated. "You all left after 2 hours and left me alone." But the argument had already escalated beyond his control. Within minutes, half the small town knew the story, and everyone had an opinion. Michael was lying about where he'd caught that bass. Things got even worse when Frank decided to turn the matter into a personal issue. "Kid, if you want to play fisherman, at least be honest. But if you're trying to take our place with lies, then this gets serious." "I'm not trying to take anyone's place. I just want to fish in peace," Michael shot back, feeling anger rise inside him. "Then prove it. Tomorrow morning, you'll fish in that pond right in front of us. If you catch another fish that size, I'll admit you're a real fisherman. If you don't, you drop this fantasy and go work at the grocery store like a normal person." The challenge was accepted publicly, and Michael realized he'd gotten himself into a situation he couldn't back out of. If he failed, he wouldn't just lose his credibility. He'd have to give up his fishing dreams for good. That night, he barely slept. Mrs. Helen tried to comfort him, but even she seemed to doubt his story. "Michael, are you sure you caught that fish where you said?" "I'm sure, Mom. I know it seems impossible, but it was there." "Then trust in God and go with faith. If you're telling the truth, He'll help you prove it." The next morning, a small crowd gathered to witness Michael's test. Frank had brought his best men, all experienced fishermen who knew every inch of the local waters. Brian and Jason were there too, along with at least 15 other curious onlookers waiting to see how the story would end. The walk to the pond was tense and silent. Michael felt the weight of their judging stares, and his confidence wavered with every step. When they finally arrived, the disappointment was unanimous. "Good Lord," murmured one woman who had insisted on coming. "This place is drier than yesterday." It was true. The water level had dropped even more overnight, and now large stretches of the pond bed were exposed. What had seemed unlikely the day before now seemed completely impossible. "So, champ," Frank taunted, "where are those giant fish?" Michael's mouth went dry. He walked to the spot where he'd fished the day before, but the channel he'd discovered was now nearly dry. His bamboo rod trembled in his hands as he searched for any area that still had enough depth. "It has to be here," he muttered to himself, setting up his gear in the only spot that still seemed to have a chance. But after an hour of fruitless attempts, it was obvious. There was nothing in that water. The crowd's silence was deafening, broken only by the hushed, spiteful remarks from a few. "I told you it was a lie," Brian said, shaking his head in disappointment. "Come on, Michael," Jason added. "Why'd you make up this story?" Frank approached with a victorious smile. "All right, game's over. Now you'll drop this fantasy and get a real job like a serious person." But Michael couldn't accept it. He knew with absolute certainty that he had caught that bass in that pond. Something had changed overnight, something he couldn't understand. "I caught it here," he shouted, louder than he intended. "I don't know what happened, but I did catch it here." "Michael, that's enough," said Brian, stepping closer to his brother. "You're making a fool of yourself in front of everyone." The humiliation was complete when the group decided to head back to town, leaving Michael alone with his defeat. He stayed there for 2 more hours, trying to figure out what had happened, but he didn't get a single bite. When he finally got home, Mrs. Helen was waiting on the porch with a look of deep concern. "Well, son?" "I didn't catch anything, Mum. Nothing at all." "Sit here with me," she said, patting the bench beside her. "Tell your mother what really happened." Michael broke down. He told her everything, from the first time he'd gone to the pond to the embarrassment of that morning. He talked about his certainty that he'd caught fish there, his confusion over the pond's changes, and his shame at being called a liar by his own friends. "My boy," Mrs. Helen said after hearing him out, "have you ever stopped to think that maybe you fished in the right place but at the wrong time?" "What do you mean, Mom?" "Your grandfather always said some places only reveal their secrets to those patient enough to wait for the right moment. Maybe that pond has its own schedule." His mother's suggestion planted a seed of hope in Michael's heart. Maybe she was right. Maybe he needed to understand the pond's rhythms better before giving up completely. But first he had to face the consequences of his public defeat. The next day, when he went out to buy medicine for his mother, he was met with laughter and sarcastic remarks wherever he went. "There goes the fisherman of invisible fish," someone shouted. "Michael, when you go fishing on the moon, let me know," said another. Things got even worse when Joe Wilson, the owner of the general store, called him over for a talk. "Look, Michael, I'd offered you a job, but after all this I need to think again. I can't have someone in my store that the whole town's making fun of." The rejection hit hard. Michael realized his reputation was ruined and his options were running out fast. But instead of giving up completely, he felt a stronger determination growing inside him. "Mum, I'm going back to that pond," he said that night, "but this time I'll study it properly. I'll figure out how it works. And if it doesn't work out, then I'll accept everyone was right and stop dreaming," Michael replied, but his voice carried a firmness he hadn't felt in days. For the next 3 days, Michael did something no one expected. Instead of fishing, he observed, he arrived at the pond at dawn and stayed until dusk, studying the water's patterns, the times it rose or fell, the movements of the few birds that visited the spot. On the 3rd day of watching, he made a surprising discovery. In the early hours between 3 and 5 in the morning, the water level rose significantly. It seemed there was some kind of underground spring that activated at specific times, filling the hidden channel he'd discovered. "So that's it," he murmured to himself, finally understanding the mystery. The next morning, Michael arrived at the pond at 2 a.m., carrying a small makeshift lantern and his fishing gear. Just as he'd observed, the water level began to rise gradually, and the hidden channel became deep and promising once again. This time, he was prepared differently. He had managed to get better hooks by trading some favors in town, and his bait included not just worms but also small pieces of fruit he'd noticed the local fish seemed to like. The first bite came at 4:30 in the morning. It was another big fish, but Michael forced himself to stay calm and use all his skill to avoid repeating past mistakes. When he finally brought the fish to shore, he saw it was an even larger trahera than the first, weighing at least 9 pounds. But the real surprise came 20 minutes later. A second bite, even stronger than the first. This time, Michael fought an epic battle that lasted nearly an hour. The fish was powerful and knew those waters well, using every rock and current to its advantage. When he finally overcame it, Michael found himself face to face with the biggest fish he'd ever seen in his life. It was a massive trahera, over 11 pounds, its scales gleaming like gold in the dim lantern light. "Now no one can say I'm lying," he muttered to himself, carefully placing both fish in his makeshift bag. But even with the evidence in hand, Michael knew the real challenge would be convincing people he hadn't rigged the situation somehow. He needed witnesses, someone to see it with their own eyes. The problem was, it was 5 in the morning, and he was alone in the middle of the arid land. Any sensible person would be asleep at home, and even if he managed to wake someone, they'd hardly believe his story without raising suspicions. That's when Michael got an idea. Instead of taking the fish to town right away, he decided to wait until later and bring some people back to the pond during the right time. If he could show them firsthand how the pond system worked, he'd have undeniable proof. But first, he needed to make sure the fish stayed fresh and presentable. He rigged up a system to keep them in running water using a small spring he'd found near the pond, then spent the rest of the morning planning his strategy. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, take a moment to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It really helps us newcomers out. Now back to the story. When he got to town around noon, Michael went straight to find Brian and Jason. He spotted them in the central square, chatting with other young men about weekend plans. "Brian, I need to talk to you guys," Michael said, trying to keep the excitement out of his voice. "Oh no, Michael," Brian replied without even looking at his brother. "If this is another fish story, I don't want to hear it." "It's not a story. I figured out how the pond works and I can prove it." Jason laughed sarcastically. "Let me guess. Now you're going to say the fish only show up during a full moon, right?" "No, listen," Michael insisted. "The pond fills up at dawn. There's an underground spring that activates between 3 and 5 in the morning. That's why when you guys went during the day, there was nothing." "Michael, for heaven's sake," Brian said, now visibly annoyed. "Didn't you learn anything from last week's embarrassment? If you don't believe me, come see for yourselves. Tomorrow at dawn, 3 in the morning at my place." The offer sounded so absurd, the two friends nearly laughed in his face. Who in their right mind would wake up at 3 in the morning to humor another one of Michael's fantasies? "All right," Jason said, clearly with no intention of following through. "If we're not busy, we'll swing by." "No, it's not like that," Michael pressed. "You have to come. It's the only chance I have to prove I'm not a liar." Michael's insistence was starting to draw attention from others in the square. A few people moved closer to listen to the conversation, and soon a small crowd had gathered to follow the discussion. "Let me get this straight," said Frank, who had appeared drawn by the commotion. "You want us to wake up at dawn to watch you catch nothing again?" "No, Mr. Frank. I want you to see me catch real big fish in the pond you think has nothing." "And if you don't succeed?" Michael took a deep breath before answering. "If I don't, I'll stop fishing forever and publicly apologize to everyone I've fooled." The bet was too serious to ignore. Frank exchanged glances with his fellow fishermen, clearly intrigued by the chance to humiliate Michael once and for all. "All right, kid. Tomorrow at 3 in the morning at your place, but if you don't catch anything in that pond, you leave here and never show up at our fishing spots again." "Deal," replied Michael, extending his hand to seal the agreement. But as soon as he got home and told his mother what he'd promised, Michael realized the weight of what he'd committed to. If he failed, he wouldn't just lose his reputation. He'd be banned from the only places he could fish in the area. "My God, Michael," said Mrs. Helen. "Are you sure about this?" "I am, Mom. I know it works. I caught 2 big fish earlier this morning." "2 fish? Where are they?" Michael had left the fish in a small spring near the pond, planning to retrieve them only after proving his point. But now he realized he should have brought at least one as evidence. "I left them near the pond, in a spring. I'll get them tomorrow after everyone sees I'm not lying." What if someone finds them and takes them? The possibility hadn't crossed Michael's mind, and now it filled him with dread. He decided he couldn't take the risk. Even with the sun still high, he made the trip back to the pond to check if his fish were safe. When he reached the spot where he'd left his catch, his heart sank. The fish were gone. He searched every corner of the spring, checked under the nearby rocks, but found nothing, not even loose scales. "This can't be happening," he muttered, feeling desperation take hold. He spent 2 hours looking, but there was no sign of the fish. Someone had taken them, or maybe a wild animal had found his makeshift hiding spot. Either way, his proof was gone. Michael returned home devastated. Now he had no evidence he'd caught anything, and he'd promised a live demonstration that depended entirely on his ability to repeat the feat. "So, son?" asked Mrs. Helen when she saw him return with his head down. "They're gone, Mum. The fish are gone." "What do you mean, gone?" "I don't know. I left them in a spring, but when I went back there was nothing." Mrs. Helen sat beside her son and held his hands. "Michael, maybe this is a sign you shouldn't have made that bet." "No, Mom. I'll do it again. I have to." But that night, Michael barely slept. He imagined 1,000 scenarios. What if the underground spring didn't work the next day? What if the fish had moved somewhere else? What if it had all just been a fluke he couldn't repeat? By 2:30 in the morning, he was already up preparing his gear. He checked every hook, every piece of line, every scrap of bait he'd gathered. He couldn't let anything go wrong because of a careless mistake. At 3 on the dot, there was a knock at his door. To his surprise, it wasn't just Brian, Jason, and Frank. A crowd of at least 20 people had gathered to watch the spectacle, including some folks Michael barely knew. "Wow, this many people," he whispered to Brian. "The news spread, Michael. Everyone wants to see if you'll actually pull it off or if you'll make a fool of yourself again." The pressure was much greater than Michael had imagined. Walking in the dark with all those people behind him was a terrifying experience, and the comments he heard along the way didn't help his confidence at all. "That boy's just going to embarrass himself again," said a voice in the darkness. "Poor Mrs. Helen, having a liar for a son," remarked another. "If he doesn't catch anything, I'll personally tell everyone in town," threatened a third voice. When they finally reached the pond, the scene was exactly as Michael had observed in the previous days. The water was low, the place seemed lifeless, and many people began muttering that they already knew how this would end. "All right, Michael," said Frank, lighting a powerful flashlight. "Now's your time to shine." Michael walked to the edge of the pond with visibly trembling hands. The equipment that had seemed adequate when he was alone now looked ridiculously amateurish under all those critical stares. His bamboo rod made a pathetic contrast to the professional gear some of the fishermen had brought. "I need to wait for the water to rise," he said, trying to buy time. "The water to rise?" Someone in the crowd laughed. "Michael, we don't have all night for your fantasies." "It's not a fantasy. Between 3 and 5 in the morning, the water rises because of an underground spring." "Oh, sure," Frank mocked. "And the fish just magically appear, right?" But Michael didn't let the taunts get to him. He positioned himself in the exact spot where he'd fished the previous dawn and waited. At 3:15, just as he'd observed, the water level began to rise gradually. "Look!" he shouted, pointing to the shore. "The water's rising!" A few people stepped closer to check, and sure enough, it was happening. Murmurs of surprise rippled through the crowd, but most remained skeptical. "Fine, the water rose a little," Brian admitted, "but that doesn't mean there are fish in there." "Now you'll see," Michael said, preparing his gear with hands still shaky but determined. At 3:40, he made his first cast. The bait sank into the dark water of the newly formed channel, and Michael settled in for what he knew would be a long wait. The crowd behind him grew restless, but he forced himself to stay focused. 15 minutes passed without so much as a tug on the line. The sarcastic comments grew louder and crueler. "Guess the fish are asleep," someone said. "Or maybe they're scared of the crowd." Another laughed. "Michael, how much longer are we supposed to wait?" Jason asked, clearly embarrassed. But at 4:05, something happened. The line jerked violently, nearly yanking the rod from Michael's hands. The crowd fell instantly silent. "He's got something," someone shouted. Michael fought to keep control. The fish on the other end was big and fought with astonishing strength. Every technique he'd learned from his grandfather came into play as he tried to tire his catch without snapping the makeshift line. "Good Lord," Frank murmured, watching the battle with wide eyes. "There's something big in there, all right." The struggle lasted 40 intense minutes. Michael was drenched in cold sweat as the fish tested every inch of his line and every knot he'd tied. The crowd had gone completely silent, all hypnotized by the display of strength and skill unfolding before them. When he finally brought the fish to the surface, a chorus of gasps echoed across the pond. It was a giant bass, even bigger than the ones he'd caught the day before, nearly 6 pounds of pure muscle. "I can't believe it," said Brian, his mouth hanging open. "Michael, this fish is huge." "And there's more," said Michael, carefully holding his catch. "The water will stay good for another hour." And he was right. Over the next 60 minutes, Michael managed to reel in 3 more big fish, all exceptionally large bass. With each new catch, the crowd grew more impressed and more respectful. Frank was the first to step forward to examine the fish up close. "Kid, I gotta admit, I've never seen anything like this in my life. These are the biggest fish that have ever come out of these parts." "How do you figure out the secret?" asked one of the older fishermen. "By watching," replied Michael, still catching his breath from the effort. "Spent 3 days just observing until I understood how it worked." The shift in people's attitudes was astonishing. In a matter of minutes, Michael went from being a ridiculed liar to a respected angler. Everyone wanted to know the details, his technique, the best times, the lures that worked. "Michael," said Frank, extending his hand, "I owe you an apology, and I want to make you an offer." "What offer?" "You teach us the secrets of this pond and we'll let you join our group. No jokes, as equals." It was more than Michael had ever dreamed of. Being accepted by the local fishermen meant access to the best spots in the area, and more importantly, a steady income. But something inside him hesitated before he could accept right away. He looked at the pond that had given him this chance and wondered if he should share his secret so easily. "Can I think about the offer?" he said, surprising everyone. "Sure, but don't take too long," replied Frank. "An opportunity like this doesn't come around twice." The walk back to town was nothing like the way there. Now Michael was the center of attention, carrying his fish like trophies and fielding congratulations and questions from all sides. Brian and Jason walked beside him with expressions of pride and a touch of embarrassment for their earlier doubts. "Man, I can't believe I doubted you," said Jason. "You're a fishing genius." "Sorry, bro," added Brian. "I was an idiot not to believe you." "It's fine, guys," replied Michael, though inside he still felt a jumble of emotions. By the time they reached town, it was nearly 7 in the morning, and the first workers were heading out. News of Michael's feat spread fast, and within minutes, a crowd had gathered in the town square to see the giant fish. Joe Wilson was one of the first to arrive. "Michael, what's this story everyone's telling?" "It's true, Mr. Joe," said Frank, before Michael could answer. "The kid found a gold mine of a pond. Caught fish even I've never seen, and I've got 40 years of experience." "Well then," said the grocer, clearly flustered. "About that job I offered? If you're still interested?" "No need, Mr. Joe," Michael replied politely. "I think I'll take a different path." The way people treated him now was surreal. In just a few hours, Michael had gone from social outcast to local celebrity. But when he finally got home, he needed to process everything that had happened. "My boy," Mrs. Helen exclaimed when she saw him walk in with the fish. "The whole street's already talking. Tell your mother everything." Michael recounted every detail of the morning, from the initial nerves to the final triumph. Mrs. Helen listened with tears in her eyes, too proud to speak. "Now, Mom, we can buy your medicine without any trouble. And I'll make good money from fishing. I always knew you were special, my son. Your grandfather would be proud." But in the days that followed, Michael realized his newfound fame brought complications he hadn't anticipated. Every day, people showed up at his house, wanting him to take groups to the secret pond. They offered money, favors, even business partnerships. The problem was, Michael had noticed the pond worked in cycles. Some weeks, it was more active, others, less so. And when too many people fished at the same time, the fish got spooked and became harder to catch. "Michael," said Frank one afternoon, accompanied by all the local fishermen, "we came up with a better proposal. How about we form some kind of cooperative? Everyone contributes and you organize regular trips to the pond." The idea was financially tempting, but something about it didn't sit right with Michael. He remembered his grandfather's words about respecting nature and not being too greedy with its resources. "Let me think about it a little longer," he replied. "Think fast, kid," said Frank, his tone no longer as friendly as before, "because if you don't want to accept our partnership, we can always figure out the pond's secrets on our own." The threat was subtle, but Michael understood perfectly. If he didn't cooperate, the group might decide to investigate the pond without him and potentially destroy the delicate balance he'd discovered. That night, Michael had a serious talk with his mother about his options. "Mom, I don't know what to do. If I accept their offer, I'll make a lot of money, but I'm afraid I'll ruin the pond. If I don't, they might force me anyway." "My son," said Mrs. Helen wisely, "sometimes we have to choose between what's easy and what's right. What do you think your grandfather would do?" The question echoed in Michael's mind all night. He remembered clearly the stories his grandfather used to tell about greedy fishermen who ended up destroying their own resources by overfishing the same spots. The next morning, Michael made a decision that surprised everyone. He went to Frank and the group of fishermen with a counteroffer. "I'll work with you," he said, "but under conditions. The pond can only be used twice a week, with no more than 5 people at a time, and I decide who goes and when." "What's this about conditions?" Frank snapped, visibly irritated. "Did you forget the pond isn't your property?" "No, but I know how it works. And if you want to keep fishing there for a long time, you'll have to respect nature's limits." The conversation that followed was tense and full of disagreements. Some fishermen thought Michael's conditions were too strict. Others understood the logic behind his concern. Frank, clearly frustrated at not having full control, decided to make a more direct threat. "Listen, kid," he said, stepping closer in a way that felt intimidating. "You'll accept our original proposal, or we'll make your life very hard in this town." "What do you mean?" Michael asked, his heart pounding. "You think just because of some big fish we're going to let you boss us around? We've had influence in this town for years. We can make sure no one buys your fish, no one gives you work, you'll go back to being a nobody." The threat was real, and Michael knew it. Frank and his group had enough influence to make his life impossible in town, but giving in to their demands would mean betraying his principles and possibly destroying the pond that had given him everything. "I need some time to think," Michael said, trying to buy himself space. 3 days, Frank replied. "You have 3 days to decide whether you want to be our partner or our enemy." Michael spent the next 3 days in deep thought. He talked to his mother, to Brian, to Jason, even to some older folks in town who had known Frank for years. Everyone shared the same opinion. It was better to accept the offer and avoid conflict. But on the 3rd night, something happened that changed everything. Michael was woken by strange noises coming from the direction of the pond. There were human voices and the sound of equipment being moved. He quickly dressed and went out to investigate. When he got close to the pond, he saw something that made him furious. Frank and at least 10 others were fishing there, using professional gear and nets that would clearly scare away all the fish in the area. Worse, they were fishing during the peak activity time of the underground spring, with no regard for preserving the place. "Hey!" Michael shouted, stepping out from behind the rocks. "What are you doing here?" "Well, well," Frank said with a sarcastic smile. "Look who showed up. We decided we didn't need to wait for your answer anymore, kid." "You can't do this, you'll ruin everything." "Who's going to stop us, you?" Frank laughed. "Look around, Michael. We've got more people, more equipment, and more experience. You should have taken our deal when you had the chance." Michael looked around and realized he was clearly outnumbered, but he couldn't just stand by and watch the destruction of the place that had changed his life. He had to do something, even if it was risky. "If you don't leave now, I'll call everyone in town to see what you're doing," he threatened. "Call who?" One of the fishermen laughed. "Everyone already knows we're here, and everyone would rather be on our side than yours." The words hit Michael like a punch to the gut. He realized he'd been completely isolated. His lone resistance wouldn't make a difference. Defeated, he walked home with a broken heart. The pond that had given him hope and dignity was being destroyed, and he was powerless to stop it. Worse, he knew that after tonight the place would never be the same. "So, son?" Mrs. Helen asked when she saw him walk in with his head down. "They're out there, Mom, fishing recklessly with no care at all. They're going to ruin everything. And what are you going to do?" "I don't know, Mom. I don't know what to do anymore." Mrs. Helen took her son's hands and looked deep into his eyes. "Michael, sometimes you have to fight for what's right even when it seems impossible to win. Your grandfather always said one honest person is worth more than 1,000 dishonest ones. But I'm alone against everyone, Mom." "Are you sure about that? Have you tried talking to people outside Frank's group?" His mother's suggestion planted an idea in Michael's mind. Maybe he'd been focusing on the wrong people. Maybe there were others in town who also cared about preserving nature and would be willing to stand with him. The next morning, Michael decided to do something he'd never tried before: talk to the town's elders, the ones who had known the area for decades and might understand the importance of protecting natural resources. The first person he went to was Mrs. Grace, a 70-year-old woman respected by the whole community for her wisdom and honesty. He told her everything, from discovering the pond to the invasion the night before. "My boy," Mrs. Grace said after listening, "that pond you're talking about, I've known it since I was a girl. My father used to fish there sometimes, but he always said you had to respect its rhythm. You know how it works?" "I do. It's a pond fed by an underground river that comes down from the hills. When my father was alive, the old fishermen knew this and respected it. But this new generation only cares about money. And what do you think I should do?" "Fight, son. Don't let these men destroy a treasure that nature took decades to create. And I'll help you." Mrs. Grace's promise of support gave Michael new energy. Together, they spent the rest of the morning talking to other older residents, sharing the story and asking for help to protect the pond. To Michael's surprise, many people were receptive to his cause. Apparently, Frank and his group weren't as popular as he'd thought. Many longtime residents resented the authoritarian way they controlled the area's fishing resources. "I always thought that Frank acted like he owned this town," said Mr. Anthony, a 65-year-old retiree. "It's about time someone stood up to him." "But how?" asked Michael. "They have equipment, they have people, and they're already at the pond." "Leave it to me," said Mrs. Grace with a mysterious smile. "I have some contacts who might help." Michael didn't understand what she meant, but he decided to trust the older woman's experience. For the rest of the day, he kept gathering support among the townspeople, especially those who felt wronged by Frank's control over the fishing resources. That evening, Mrs. Grace showed up at Michael's house with surprising news. "My boy, I got in touch with the Regional Environmental Institute. They're sending a technician tomorrow to assess the pond's situation." "How so?" "Turns out this pond might qualify as a permanent preservation area because of the underground spring. If it's confirmed, no one can fish there without special permission." The information completely changed the situation. If the pond became officially protected, Frank and his group would be forced to stop their illegal activities. But it also meant Michael himself would lose free access to the spot. "Mrs. Grace, but if the pond becomes a protected area, I won't be able to fish there either." "Not necessarily," she replied. "Whoever discovered how the pond works and showed concern for its preservation might get permission for sustainable fishing." The possibility of a legal solution to the conflict filled Michael with hope. But he knew that until the environmental technician arrived, Frank and his group would keep damaging the pond. Every passing day meant more harm to the delicate balance of the place. That night, Michael barely slept, thinking about all the possibilities. If everything worked out, he wouldn't just regain access to the pond. He'd also have legal backing to protect it. If it went wrong, he could lose his fishing spot forever and still face Frank's hostility. The next day, the environmental technician arrived earlier than expected. He was a young man around 30, with a degree in biology and a specialization in aquatic ecosystems. Michael grew nervous, realizing his entire situation depended on a stranger's assessment. "So you're the young man who figured out this pond's patterns?" asked the technician, introducing himself as Dr. Robert. "Yes, sir, I spent days observing it before I understood how it worked." "Interesting. Very few people these days have the patience for that kind of natural observation. Can you show me the spot?" The walk to the pond was tense for Michael. He knew Frank and his group were likely still there, and he wasn't sure how they'd react to an environmental technician. When they arrived, the scene was even worse than Michael had imagined. Dozens of people were fishing chaotically, using heavy equipment and leaving trash scattered along the banks. The water was murky from all the commotion, and it was clear the fish had moved away from the area. "Good Lord," murmured Dr. Robert, taking in the devastation. "This is an environmental disaster." Frank noticed the two of them and approached with an unfriendly expression. "And you two, what are you doing here?" "I'm a technician from the Regional Environmental Institute," replied Dr. Robert, showing his identification. "I'm here to assess potential environmental violations in this area." "Violations?" Frank laughed. "We're just fishing in a public spot. There's nothing illegal about that." "We'll see," said Dr. Robert, pulling some measuring equipment from his backpack. Over the next 2 hours, the technician conducted a full assessment of the pond. He tested the water quality, examined the surrounding vegetation, studied the current patterns, and documented the damage caused by overfishing. Michael watched anxiously, hoping the results would be in their favor. "Well," Dr. Robert finally said, "this pond is fed by an underground aquifer connected to the water system of the hills. Under environmental law, that classifies it as a permanent preservation area." Frank visibly bristled at the news. "And what does that mean?" "It means all fishing activity here requires special authorization from the Environmental Institute, and from what I can see, you don't have that authorization." "So, we can't fish here anymore?" asked one of the fishermen. "You can, but only under specific conditions that ensure the ecosystem's sustainability," Dr. Robert explained, "and only under the supervision of someone who understands the natural patterns of this place." All eyes turned to Michael. It was obvious he was the only person there who fit that description. Frank immediately sensed the complete shift in power. "Hold on," he said, trying to stay in control. "This kid isn't qualified to supervise anything." "Actually," Dr. Robert replied, "from what I've observed, he has a very solid empirical understanding of this pond's natural cycles. And he's shown concern for preservation, which is essential for this kind of activity." Michael could hardly believe what he was hearing. In just a few hours, he'd gone from being a victim to the pond's official guardian. But he knew this victory came with huge responsibilities. "Dr. Robert," he said, "if I take on this responsibility, what kind of rules will I have to follow?" "Basically, you'll need to set sustainable quotas, appropriate fishing hours, and limits on the number of people per session. Everything documented and reported monthly to the Institute." It was exactly what Michael had originally proposed, but now with official legal backing. Frank and his group would have no choice but to accept his terms or lose access to the pond entirely. "I accept," Michael said, feeling a mix of pride and apprehension. "Excellent," Dr. Robert replied. "I'll prepare the official paperwork. In the meantime, all fishing activity in this area must stop immediately until the new rules are in place." The order hit Frank and his group like a bombshell. They'd not only lost control of the pond, but also temporary access until Michael organized the new system. Frustration was written all over their faces. "This isn't over," Frank muttered to Michael as he gathered his gear. "You might have won today, but life in town is long." The veiled threat worried Michael, but he knew he now had legal protection for his work. More importantly, he had the chance to turn his discovery into something sustainable and lasting. In the days that followed, Michael worked closely with Dr. Robert to establish the pond's official usage rules. They created a scheduling system that respected the natural water cycles, limited the number of fishermen per session, and established quotas to ensure continuous fish reproduction. "Michael," said Dr. Robert on their last day working together, "you have a natural talent for environmental management. Have you ever thought about studying biology or environmental science?" The suggestion planted a seed in Michael's mind. Maybe his experience with the pond was just the beginning of something bigger. Perhaps he could turn his passion for fishing into a professional career, but first, he had to deal with the practical consequences of his new position. Frank had made good on his threat to make Michael's life difficult in town. Few merchants wanted to buy his fish, some basic services became more expensive, and malicious gossip spread in the places he frequented. "Mom," Michael said one particularly tough afternoon, "sometimes I wonder if all this struggle was worth it." "My son," Mrs. Helen replied, "doing the right thing is never easy, but it's the only way we can sleep peacefully at night." His mother's wisdom was true, but it didn't solve the practical problems Michael faced. He needed to find a way to earn income from fishing without relying on local merchants influenced by Frank. Then Brian suggested something that changed everything. "Michael, why don't you start taking tourists fishing at the pond? There are plenty of people from big cities who'd pay good money for a special fishing experience." The idea was brilliant. Instead of competing with local fishermen, Michael could create an entirely different niche, offering sustainable fishing experiences to nature-loving visitors. "But how do I attract tourists?" Michael asked. "Leave that to me," said Jason. "My cousin works at a travel agency in Phoenix. I bet he'd be interested in offering eco-friendly fishing tours." The plan developed quickly. Within 2 weeks, Michael had set up a small eco-friendly fishing tourism business. He offered authentic fishing experiences in a preserved environment, complete with explanations about the pond's natural cycles and the importance of sustainability. The first group of tourists arrived on a Saturday morning, 5 people from Phoenix interested in sport fishing, willing to pay well for a unique experience. Michael was nervous about impressing paying customers. "Everyone," he said by the pond's edge, "let me explain how this special place works. This pond has a very specific natural cycle we need to respect." Over the next few hours, Michael shared everything he had learned, from the patterns of the underground spring to the best techniques for not scaring the fish. The tourists were fascinated, not just by the fishing, but by Michael's knowledge and passion. "Son," one of them said, "you've got a real gift for this. I've never heard someone explain nature so interestingly." "That's true," another agreed. "You should write a book about your discoveries." The day was a complete success. All the tourists caught good-sized fish, learned about sustainability, and left satisfied. Most importantly, they promised to spread the word about Michael's work. In the following weeks, his business grew rapidly. Positive word of mouth attracted more tourist groups, and soon he had bookings for weeks ahead. His monthly income surpassed anything he'd ever imagined possible with fishing. Frank watched Michael's success with a mix of frustration and envy. His group had not only lost privileged access to the pond, but was now seeing an amateur thrive in what they considered their territory. "This is ridiculous," Frank complained during a meeting with his fishermen. "Some kid is making more money than us, even though we've got decades of experience." "What can we even do?" asked one of the fishermen. "He's got legal protection now." "Legal or not, there's always a way to handle things," Frank muttered, though he didn't elaborate on what he had in mind. Michael, focused on growing his business, didn't notice the tensions building at first. He was too busy refining his tour routes and studying to improve his environmental knowledge. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel. It really helps us out as we're just getting started. Now, back to the story. It was Mrs. Grace who first sensed something was wrong. "Michael, my boy, you need to be careful. Frank's people are saying things that don't sit right with me." "What kind of things, Mrs. Grace?" "They're saying you've gotten too full of yourself, that you've forgotten the folks from your own town. They're trying to turn public opinion against you." The news worried Michael. He knew his reputation in town was crucial for his business's survival. If the locals turned on him, it'd be nearly impossible to keep operating. "What do you think I should do?" "Show the town that your success can benefit everyone. Don't let them paint you as selfish." Mrs. Grace's advice was wise, but Michael wasn't sure how to put it into action. How could he share the benefits of his business without harming the pond's sustainability? The answer came during a conversation with Dr. Robert, who had returned for a quarterly project review. "Michael, have you considered training other locals to offer ecotourism services too?" "How do you mean?" "You could teach sustainable fishing techniques to others, creating a network of local guides. It'd bring jobs to the town and take some pressure off you." The idea was perfect. Instead of monopolizing fishing tourism, Michael could expand the concept and involve others in the community. It wouldn't just ease political tensions, It had also let him handle more tourist groups. Michael got to work right away. First, he talked to Brian and Jason about joining as assistant guides. Then he reached out to other young folks in town interested in fishing and tourism. "Listen up," he said during a meeting in the town square. "I want to propose a partnership. I'll teach sustainable fishing techniques to anyone who wants to learn, and we can work together serving tourists." The response was surprisingly positive. Many young locals were unemployed or stuck in jobs they hated. The chance to work in ecotourism appealed to quite a few, but Frank saw Michael's expansion as an even bigger threat. "Now he wants to take over all the tourism in the area," he grumbled to his companions. "If we let him, soon there won't be room for anyone else." "Frank," said one of the older fishermen in the group, "maybe it's time we stop fighting the boy and try joining him instead." "Joining him?" Frank snapped. "After everything he's done? Never!" Frank's stubbornness was isolating him even within his own group. Many local fishermen began seeing Michael as an opportunity rather than a threat, especially when they saw he was truly willing to share knowledge and opportunities. Michael's training program was a success. Within a month, he'd trained 8 new eco-guides, all capable of leading tourist groups with environmental knowledge and responsibility. The demand for tours increased significantly, and the whole town began to benefit from the tourist activity. "Michael," the mayor said in an informal chat, "what you've done here is bringing new money to the town. Local businesses are selling more. People are renting rooms to tourists, even the gas station is busier." The official recognition of the positive impact of his work was gratifying for Michael. He had managed to turn his personal discovery into a collective benefit, just as he had always dreamed. But success also brought new challenges. With more tourist groups visiting the area, extra care was needed to maintain the sustainability of the pond. Michael had to create stricter control and monitoring systems. "Dr. Robert," he said during one of the technicians' quarterly visits, "I'm worried we might be overusing the pond." "On the contrary," the biologist replied after analyzing the data, "the numbers show the ecosystem remains stable. Your quota and rotation system is working perfectly." The scientific confirmation that his efforts were successful gave Michael even more confidence. He began receiving invitations to speak in other towns about sustainable tourism and natural resource management. It was during one of these talks in the neighboring town of Pleasant Hills that Michael met Rachel, a 25-year-old biology student researching aquatic ecosystems in the backcountry. She was impressed by Michael's practical knowledge and asked to visit his pond. "It's amazing how you've mapped natural patterns just by observation," Rachel said after seeing the project. "This is high-quality scientific research." "I'm not sure it's really scientific," Michael replied modestly. "I just paid attention to what nature was showing me." "That's exactly what science is," Rachel laughed. "Careful observation, hypothesis testing, and evidence-based system development." The conversation with Rachel opened Michael's eyes to possibilities he had never considered. Perhaps his empirical work could be formalized into scientific research. Maybe he could contribute to academic knowledge about sustainable management. "Rachel," he said after a few days of reflection, "do you think it'd be possible to turn what I've learned here into some kind of formal study?" "Of course," she replied enthusiastically. "We can document your methods, measure the results, and publish a paper on community-based aquatic resource management." The idea was exciting, but also intimidating. Michael had never imagined his work could have academic relevance. But Rachel convinced him that successful practical experiences were extremely valuable to the scientific community. Over the following months, Rachel regularly visited the pond to document Michael's methods and measure the project's environmental and socio-economic impacts. She discovered that the system Michael developed was not only effective, but also innovative in its simplicity and efficiency. "Michael," she said one afternoon, "you've created a model that could be replicated in other regions of the country. This is really important." "Seriously?" "Very seriously. Most ecotourism projects fail because they can't balance environmental sustainability with economic viability. You've achieved that naturally." Working with Rachel added a new dimension to Michael's project. He began to understand that his local experience had much broader implications and could contribute to environmental solutions on a regional scale. But the growing success also intensified Frank's hostility. The older fisherman saw each of Michael's achievements as a personal defeat, and his frustration was reaching troubling levels. "That kid is taking away our tradition," Frank complained one afternoon in the square. "Before long, they'll say we don't know how to fish." "Frank," said one of the older residents, "the boy isn't competing with you. He's creating something new." "Something new, my foot! He's taking advantage of a place that's always been ours." Frank's bitterness was starting to affect even his closest friends. Many could see that his anger had more to do with wounded pride than any real concern for tradition or the local economy. Things came to a head one afternoon when Frank decided to confront Michael publicly during a visit from tourists. He showed up at the pond with a few companions, clearly drunk and visibly agitated. "Hey, tourists!" he shouted. "You're being fooled by this kid. He doesn't know a thing about real fishing." Michael felt his heart race. There was a group of 6 tourists from Chicago at the pond, and the last thing he needed was an ugly scene that could ruin his reputation. "Mr. Frank," he said, trying to stay calm, "please don't do this here." "Don't do what? Tell the truth?" Frank yelled, stepping dangerously close. "You're a fraud, kid, a liar tricking outsiders." The tourists watched with a mix of discomfort and concern. Michael knew he had to resolve the situation quickly, without escalating the conflict. "Folks," he said to the tourists, "let's step back for a moment while I handle this." But Frank wasn't about to let things cool down. No, let them see who you really are. Tell them how you stole our fishing spot." "I didn't steal anything," Michael shot back, feeling anger rise inside him. "I found this place when no one else believed in it." "Found it?" Frank laughed bitterly. "My father fished here before you were born." The statement caught Michael off guard. It was the first time he'd heard anyone mention fishing at the pond in the past. If true, it completely changed the context of his discovery. "If your father fished here, why did you all stop coming?" Michael asked, genuinely curious. Because... Frank hesitated, clearly thrown by the question. It was one of the tourists, an older man with fishing experience, who broke the stalemate. "Excuse me for interrupting," he said, "but from what I gather, this young man has created a sustainable system that benefits the whole community. That shouldn't be cause for conflict." "You don't understand a thing," Frank snapped. "This place has always been ours." "But you weren't using it," the tourist replied calmly. "Now it's being used responsibly, bringing income to people in town." The simple logic left Frank without a solid argument. His anger was rooted more in pride and frustration than in practical concerns or fairness. Realizing he was losing control of the situation, Frank did the unthinkable. He lunged at Michael with clenched fists, clearly intent on physical violence. But before he could reach the young man, Brian and Jason came running and stepped between them. "Easy there, Mr. Frank," said Brian. "This isn't worth it." "Get out of the way, boy," Frank growled. "This is between me and your brother." "No, it's not," Jason said firmly. "Michael's working honestly and helping the whole town. You're the one in the wrong." Their intervention stopped a physical fight, but it was clear the situation had reached a breaking point. Michael realized he'd need to take stronger steps to protect his work and his safety. That night, he had a serious talk with Rachel about the threats he was facing. "Rachel," he said, "I'm starting to wonder if all this is even worth it. I don't want to live in fear of being attacked." "Michael," she said, "you can't give up now. Your work is too important. We'll find a way to resolve this." "How?" "What if we organized a public meeting, the whole town, including Frank, to openly discuss the benefits and problems of the project?" Rachel's idea was risky, but it could also be the definitive solution to the conflict. A public discussion would allow all viewpoints to be heard and let the community make a collective decision about the project's future. "Do you think Frank would agree to participate?" asked Michael. "If it's an open forum with everyone in town, he can't refuse without looking afraid of debate." Michael spent several days considering the proposal. It was a high-stakes gamble. If the meeting went well, he'd have solid public support for his work. If it went badly, he could lose everything he'd built. Finally, he decided to accept the challenge. With help from Mrs. Grace and the mayor, they organized a public meeting for the following Friday in the church hall. the largest covered space in town. News of the meeting spread quickly, and soon the whole town was talking about it. Some people supported Michael, others sympathized with Frank, and many were genuinely interested in understanding the situation better. On the night of the meeting, the hall was packed. Michael arrived with Rachel, Brian, Jason, and Mrs. Helen. Frank showed up with his most loyal fishermen and a few other residents who felt wronged by the project's success. The mayor opened the meeting by explaining that the goal was to civilly discuss the impacts of the ecotourism project on the town. Each side would have a chance to present their arguments, followed by an open debate. Michael was the first to speak. He explained how he had discovered the patterns of the pond, developed the sustainable system, and how the project was benefiting the town economically. He presented concrete numbers on job creation, income growth, and tourist activity. "Folks," he said, "my goal was never to harm anyone. I want everyone in our town to have the chance to benefit from this work." Frank spoke next, but his presentation was less organized and more emotional. He complained about losing tradition, young people disrespecting their elders, and changes he believed harmed the town's identity. "This boy is changing our town," he said. "Soon we won't even recognize our own home." The debate that followed was intense but civil. Several residents asked questions to both Michael and Frank, trying to better understand the implications of each position. It was Mrs. Grace who asked the most important question. "Frank, can you explain why your group stopped using the pond before Michael discovered the right way to fish there?" The question caught Frank off guard. He hesitated for a few seconds before answering, because back then it wasn't worth it. Too much work for too little reward. "Then Michael didn't take anything from you," Mrs. Grace continued. "He found value where you saw none." But tradition?" Frank tried to argue. "Tradition isn't staying stuck in time," Mrs. Grace replied. "Tradition is adapting old knowledge to new needs." The comment from the town's most respected woman had a profound impact on the audience. Many began to see the situation differently, realizing Michael had innovated rather than simply taking what already existed. Rachel seized the moment to present the scientific data she had collected about the project. It showed how Michael's system was effectively preserving the pond's ecosystem while generating sustainable economic benefits. "Michael's work is an example of how communities can thrive while respecting nature," she explained. "This should be a source of pride for the whole town." The scientific presentation impressed many people, especially those who still had doubts about the legitimacy of Michael's work. Seeing concrete data on sustainability and economic impact changed several opinions. When it was time for closing remarks, the atmosphere in the room had shifted significantly. Frank noticed he was losing support even among his traditional allies. "Listen," said one of the older fishermen in Frank's group, "maybe it's time we stop fighting and start collaborating." "Collaborating?" asked Frank, surprised. "Yeah, the kid has offered several times to include us in the project. Maybe we should accept instead of keeping up this fight." The suggestion came from someone Frank respected, making it hard for him to dismiss outright. Other fishermen in the group expressed similar interest in finding a way to join the project rather than oppose it. Michael realized this was the decisive moment. He stood up and addressed Frank directly. "Mr. Frank, would you like to be my partner in this project?" The question stunned everyone in the room, especially Frank. After months of conflict, the partnership offer seemed almost surreal. "Partner how?" asked Frank, clearly suspicious. "You have decades of fishing experience. I have specific knowledge of this pond. Together, we could create something greater than either of us could alone." The proposal was too generous to reject publicly. Frank found himself in a position where refusing would seem petty, but accepting would mean acknowledging the value of Michael's work. "And what would my role be in this partnership?" he asked, trying to buy time. "You'd oversee the technical training of new guides. I'd handle the scientific side and itinerary planning. We'd split the profits 50-50. The offer was more than fair. It was generous. Michael was offering half of a thriving business to someone who'd spent months trying to sabotage him. The gesture's significance wasn't lost on the audience. Frank looked around the room and realized all eyes were on him, waiting for his answer. If he refused, he'd be seen as stubborn and small-minded. If he accepted, he'd have to swallow his wounded pride. "I need to think," he finally said. "Of course," replied Michael. "No rush. The offer stands." The meeting ended with a general sense that the situation had finally found a path to resolution. Most left convinced Michael's project benefited the town, and that including Frank could make it even better. In the following days, social pressure on Frank to accept the partnership grew intense. His own friends advised him to swallow his pride and join the project, and even his wife urged him to stop being stubborn. "Frank," she said one morning, "you're 50 years old with a family to support. You can't waste an opportunity like this over pride." "But what will people think?" and he argued, "and they'll say I gave in." "They'll say you were smart," his wife countered, "and that you recognized value when you saw it." Family pressure proved decisive. A week after the public meeting, Frank approached Michael to accept the partnership. "All right, kid," he said, clearly uncomfortable. "Let's try this partnership." "That's great, Mr. Frank," Michael replied with a genuine smile. "We'll work together and create something truly special." The partnership between Michael and Frank surprised everyone with how quickly it worked. Frank's hands-on experience perfectly complemented Michael's scientific knowledge, and together they created a guide training system that was both technical and sustainable. "You know something, kid," Frank said one afternoon as they watched a group of tourists successfully fishing in the pond. "You've really got a knack for this." "You do too, Mr. Frank. Your experience makes all the difference." The transformation in their relationship was remarkable. In just a few months, they went from enemies to effective partners, and their collaboration made the project even more successful. The business grew rapidly under their joint management. They expanded to other ponds in the area, always following the same principles of sustainability and community inclusion. Within a year, they had built an eco-tourism network that employed over 30 people from town. "Michael," Rachel said during one of her visits, "you've created a sustainable development model that should be studied in universities." "Really?" "Absolutely. I'm writing my master's thesis on this project, and 3 other universities are already interested in research partnerships." The academic recognition added a new dimension to the project. Michael was invited to speak at sustainable tourism conferences and received proposals to replicate his model in other parts of the country. But despite all the outside opportunities, he chose to keep his focus on the local community. "Mum," he said one evening, "I think my place is right here. This is where I can really make a difference." "I knew you'd say that," Mrs. Helen smiled. "I always knew you had roots in your heart." 2 years after the pond's discovery, Michael looked at everything he had built with a mix of pride and gratitude. His mother had access to the best medicine, his town had been economically transformed, and he had proven it was possible to thrive while respecting nature. "You know something," Frank said one afternoon as they packed up equipment after another successful workday. "You taught me that sometimes the young ones are the ones who know best." "And you taught me that experience is priceless," Michael replied. "We make a good team." "That we do," Frank agreed. "Who'd have thought I'd end up working with the kid I thought was going to steal my spot?" "I didn't steal anything, Mr. Frank. We built something new together." Michael's reflection was true. They hadn't just discovered a productive pond. They had created a development model that respected traditions while embracing innovation. They had proven collaboration was more powerful than competition. On the last expedition of the season, Michael took a special group of tourists to the pond, researchers from various universities who wanted to see firsthand how the project worked. Among them was Dr. Robert, who had become a regular scientific partner. "Michael," Dr. Robert said, as they watched the young man explain the pond's natural cycles to the researchers, "you've come a long way since we first met." "How so?" "When we met, you were a talented young man with natural intuition. Now you're a recognized expert who combines hands-on knowledge with scientific rigor." The comment made Michael reflect on his journey. In 2 years, he had gone from a desperate young man trying to support his family to a respected entrepreneur consulted by universities and environmental agencies. But the most rewarding moment came when one of the researchers, a professor from Arizona State University, made an unexpected offer. "Michael, how would you feel about going back to school? We have an opening for a master's degree in environmental management that would be perfect for you." The offer was tempting, but Michael knew his formal education could wait. There was too much work to do in his town, too many people to train, too many projects to expand. "Professor," he replied, "I really appreciate the offer. But for now, my place is here, learning and teaching through experience." "I understand," she said. "But whenever you're ready to formalize all that knowledge, our door is open." That night, Michael took one last walk alone to the pond. It was the first time in months he had visited the place without a group of tourists, without work partners, without professional responsibilities. Just him and the pond that had changed his life. He sat on the same rock where he had caught his first big fish and reflected on everything that had happened. 2 years ago, he was just a desperate young man everyone mocked for fishing in a seemingly worthless pond. Now he was a thriving businessman who had transformed not only his own life, but the entire economy of his town. "Thank you," he whispered to the pond, knowing it might sound silly, but feeling it was right. The gentle night breeze seemed to answer, carrying the sound of flowing water he had learned to recognize as music. Michael felt a deep peace, knowing he had found his purpose in life. When he got home, he found Mrs. Helen waiting on the porch, with a smile that lit up her whole face. "So, my businessman, how was your day?" "It was good, Mom, really good." "I have some news for you," she said, her eyes shining with joy. "What news?" "I managed to book an appointment with that specialist in Phoenix. The doctor, they say, can finally figure out what's really wrong with me." The news filled Michael with hope. Finally, his mother would get the proper treatment she had always deserved. All the work, all the struggle, all the determination had been worth it to reach this moment. "Mom," he said, hugging Mrs. Helen tightly, "we did it. We really did it." "No, my son," she replied, stroking his hair like when he was a child. "You did it. You never gave up, even when everyone doubted you." But Michael knew his mother was wrong. He hadn't done it alone. He had done it with Brian and Jason's help, with Mrs. Grace's wisdom, with Rachel and Dr. Robert's knowledge, with Frank's experience, and most of all, with Mrs. Helen's unconditional love and support. He had succeeded because he had learned that the greatest victories don't come from competition, but from collaboration, not from domination, but from sustainability, not from greed, but from generosity. The next morning, Michael woke up early as he always did, but this time not to fish or work. He woke up for something much more special, taking his mother to the appointment in Phoenix they had dreamed of for so long. As they walked to the bus stop, Mrs. Helen held her son's arm firmly. "Michael, no matter what the doctor says today, I want you to know I'm the proudest mother in the world." "Mom, no, let me say this. You took an impossible situation and turned it into something beautiful. Not just for our family, but for the whole town. That's a gift from God." His mother's words touched Michael's heart deeply. He thought about the long road he had traveled, from his first failed attempts at the pond to this very moment, and realized every obstacle had been an opportunity to grow. When the bus arrived, Michael helped his mother board and chose the best seat for her. As the small town faded behind them through the window, he knew he wasn't just taking his mother to a doctor's appointment. He was carrying the certainty that he had found his place in the world. The pond everyone considered useless had turned out to be a treasure. The young man everyone dismissed as a dreamer had become a respected leader. The town that seemed destined for oblivion had transformed into an example of sustainable development. And it had all started with one determined young man who refused to accept that others were right when they said he was wasting his time fishing in a dried-up pond in the middle of the desert. The appointment in Phoenix confirmed their best hopes. The specialist not only correctly diagnosed Mrs. Helen's condition, but also assured her that with the right treatment, she would live a normal, healthy life. "Mrs. Helen," the doctor said, "with the right medication and regular checkups, you'll be just fine. It's nothing serious, just needed the right diagnosis." The news felt like a year-end gift. Michael hugged his mother right there in the office, feeling like all the pieces of his life had finally fallen into place. On the way home, Mrs. Helen looked at her son with tears of happiness in her eyes. My son, do you know what makes me happiest? What, Mum? It's not just that I'm going to be okay. It's knowing you've found your path in life, that you've become the man I always knew you could be. And this is just the beginning, Mum, Michael replied, gazing out the bus window at the semi-arid landscape he now saw with completely different eyes. There's still so much to do, so many people to help. I know, my son, and I also know you'll do everything right, just like you always have. When they arrived back in town that evening, Brian and Jason were waiting eagerly to hear about the appointment. The joy was shared by all when they heard the good news. Man, Jason said, hugging Michael, now everything's really falling into place. Your mum's going to be okay. The business is thriving, everyone's working together. Yeah, Brian agreed. You pulled off what seemed impossible, brother. But Michael knew the most important thing wasn't the material achievements or the business's success. The most important thing was learning that ordinary people can do extraordinary things when they have determination, when they respect nature, and when they work together instead of against each other. That night, as the whole family sat down to dinner together for the first time in months with light hearts, Michael looked around the table and knew he had found the true meaning of success. It wasn't about catching the biggest fish or making more money than others. It was about creating something that made a difference in the lives of the people he loved. End of story. Now tell us what you thought of the story and where you're watching from. If you have something to share with us, leave your honest thoughts in the comments. Do you think Michael made the right decisions by turning his discovery into a sustainable project? We'd love to hear your opinion. Thank you so much for being here. Don't forget to like and, most importantly, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss other inspiring stories.